think it's likely to be quite traumatic, as it would with anybody. I think the sort of effects that it will have is to cause somebody to be much more fearful of any of these similar situations in the future. I think the little bit of research that's been done on people with autism is that if they're being restrained or if they're being taken to places against their will, if they don't understand what's happening or they think it's a form of punishment, that it's really indistinguishable from a form of abuse.
And where does this kind of treatment even spring from? What even motivates it?
I think a lot of the time it's a desperate measure by people who don't know how to prevent these sort of things from happening. I think one of the key things is when challenges arrive, people often ask themselves a particular question, which is, how do I stop this behavior from happening? And I think one of the big secrets is to ask yourself a different question, which is, how do I teach the person to do something different in this situation?
And so how do we prevent this kind of mistreatment then? Is it just a matter of figuring out alternate ways to cope with this behavior?
I think that's one part of it. I think the first thing is there's no quick fix in these situations. It requires a fairly comprehensive and a long-term approach. The key, I think, is to put yourself in the shoes of somebody on the autism spectrum. And I don't know whether you've ever traveled and gone somewhere that's very, very different in terms of your own culture and language and understanding. But I've been to China, and I know that when I was there, I can't read the writing, I can't understand the language, the culture and the behaviors are very different. In that environment, I feel anxious and it's difficult, and I find it hard to communicate and get my needs met. That, in a sense, is some of the experience of people on the spectrum. And I think in understanding that, part of what we aim to try and do is develop countries, cultures, environments that meet the needs of people on the spectrum. So specifically, that might be something like having some predictability in your day, knowing when you get up in the morning, what am I going to do today, in what order, what are going to be the fun things, what's going to excite me, and what changes might happen in my day. That would be one thing. Another thing might be around communication. Many people on the autism spectrum struggle to communicate in a way that meets their needs, and there are many options in terms of speech therapy or other ways of communicating that can help people get their messages across. So I think a really good practice autism approach is very broad and encourages, I think, a lot of respect and understanding. The last thing I'd say is really that where there are behaviors of concern arising is to use a positive behavior support framework to understand why the behavior happens, and that's always based on an assessment, to think about what's the purpose of the behavior from the person's point of view, and then to have an approach that has a number of bits to it. But yes, certainly around teaching behaviors, preventing the problems from arising in the first place, and then really good reinforcement.
And a lot of affected people have come from less economically stable families or families from lower socioeconomic brackets. Does the responsibility then fall on the government to provide more assistance and support?
Yeah, I think it's partly about the amount of assistance. We work with Aspect in a lot of disadvantaged regions of Sydney, particularly sort of around Penrith and Western Sydney. And there are services there. I think part of the challenge that providers have, government providers, non-government providers, schools, is actually reaching out to some families who might not be able to hear about us. There are certainly services that will come and provide support in family homes. There's a range of other services, therapies, parent groups. I think it's just really building that community and building that network so nobody slips through the gap and nobody realizes that there is help available if you just know where to reach out to find it.
So you're saying that currently there are support systems in place, but many people just don't access them.
I think that's right. Particularly, I guess, if you're perhaps new to the country or from another culture and you don't necessarily find it easy to access particular services. What's, I guess, key in Australia at the moment is the rollout of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and that certainly should increase the availability of services, but we'll still have to work really hard, I think, to make sure that people know what's available and that they can access all of the stuff that they are eligible for.
And so we've seen a pretty big shift, I suppose, in terms of attitudes towards autism and people on the autism spectrum. Do you think that things are changing for autistic people? Yeah,
I think very slowly they are. I think there's a lot more attitudes around respecting the values, the strengths, the talents that people on the autism spectrum bring to the world. There's the neurodiversity movement, which I think is very much about respecting all types of different behavior, different ways of seeing the world, different ways of thinking about things, and really respecting that there is a value to that. Our own organisation had a campaign called A Different Brilliant last year, which was very much, again, about highlighting that people on the autism spectrum sometimes maybe do things a little bit differently, but there is actually sometimes a real